The morning of August 17th, 1943 began like most mornings at Hardwick Airfield in Norfolk, England, with fog, the smell of aviation fuel, and the quiet dread that settles into men who know they are about to fly into flak. Second Lieutenant Carl Norden sat in the briefing room. Not the inventor, but a bombardier who carried the inventor's name like a talisman, a young man from Ohio who had been told since flight school that he was entrusted with the most precise instrument in the history of warfare. The Norden bomb sight, a device so secret that bombardiers were required to sign an oath swearing to destroy it before allowing it to fall into enemy hands. A device so revered that the Army Air Forces built an entire strategic doctrine around it. The target that morning was the Schweinfurt ball-bearing complex in Bavaria. The briefing officer used a pointer and a map. He spoke calmly about altitude, bombing from 23,000 feet, and about the Norden. He told the assembled crews that the Norden could, under optimal conditions, place a bomb within 100 feet of a target from 4 miles up. He did not dwell on what optimal conditions meant. He did not mention cloud cover. He did not mention the 360 anti-aircraft guns ringing Schweinfurt. He did not mention the Messerschmitt 109s. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What he also did not mention, because the Army Air Forces did not yet fully understand themselves, was that somewhere in the English Midlands, a quiet, methodical engineer named Lieutenant Colonel Kenneth Tinkler was sitting in a workshop surrounded by gyroscopes, mirror assemblies, and engineering notebooks, convinced that the bomb sight the entire American strategic bombing campaign rested upon had a fundamental and catastrophic flaw. Not in its optics, not in its gyroscope, not in the mathematics of its analog computer. The flaw, Tinkler believed, was in its range, in what it was being asked to do from altitudes and at speeds that Carl Norden himself had never fully anticipated when he designed the instrument in the 1920s. The story of what Tinkler did about that belief, the modifications he built, the brass he defied, the commanding general who threatened him with a court-martial, and the single mission over a narrow bridge in occupied France that proved him right, is not a famous story. It does not appear in the glossy commemorative volumes sold at Air Museum gift shops. It does not have a Hollywood ending with metal pinned on a chest by a grateful general. It is the story of a man who understood something important and refused to stop saying so, even when the institution he served told him repeatedly to sit down and be quiet. To understand what Tinkler saw, you have to understand what the Norden bomb sight actually was and what it was not. Carl Lucas Norden was a Dutch-born engineer who immigrated to the United States and spent the 1920s and 30s designing precision instruments for the Navy. The bomb sight he developed was, by the standards of its era, a genuine marvel. At its heart was a stabilized platform, a gyroscopically level base that kept the optical telescope pointed straight down regardless of how the aircraft pitched and rolled around it. Attached to that platform was an analog computer, a mechanical brain of gears, cams, and levers that could take inputs, aircraft speed, altitude, wind drift, and the trajectory of a falling bomb, and calculate the precise moment of release. The principle was elegant. A bombardier would spend the final minutes of the bomb run using a telescope to track the target visually. As the target drifted through the crosshairs, the bombardier would make corrections. The computer would accumulate those corrections. At the calculated release point, it would drop the bombs automatically, removing the tremor of a human hand from the equation. The system genuinely worked. In laboratory conditions, on calm days, against stationary targets, from altitudes below 15,000 feet, it was capable of impressive accuracy. The Army Air Forces tested it over the Mojave Desert, and the results were extraordinary. The legend of the pickle barrel was born. By 1942, the USAF had made precision daylight strategic bombing the cornerstone of their contribution to the defeat of Nazi Germany. The British flew at night and bombed cities in area attacks. The Americans would fly by day and destroy specific targets, factories, rail yards, oil refineries, bridges, with surgical precision. The Norden was the instrument that made the entire theory possible. Without it, daylight strategic bombing was simply expensive suicide. With it, it was science. The problem was Europe. Europe was not the Mojave Desert. Over Germany and occupied France, bombers flew at altitudes above 20,000 feet to avoid the worst of the flak. At those altitudes, a jet stream, a river of wind moving at speeds sometimes exceeding 150 miles per hour, tore across the sky in ways that the Norden's wind correction mechanism struggled to fully compensate for. The bombers themselves flew in large formations for mutual protection, which meant bomb runs had to be straight and level for long stretches, giving anti-aircraft gunners predictable targeting solutions. The aircraft vibrated constantly from engine harmonics and from the turbulence of other aircraft nearby. The bombardier wore oxygen equipment and heavy gloves that made fine instrument manipulation difficult. The cold at altitude could seize the Norden's gyroscopes. The optics fogged. The circular error probable. The military's measure of bombing accuracy, defined as the radius within which half of all bombs would land, was supposed to be around 100 feet in operational conditions. The actual figure, compiled from post-strike photography during the early years of the European air campaign, was closer to 1,000 feet, sometimes worse. The bombs were landing a fifth of a mile from where they were aimed. Kenneth Tinkler had been watching these statistics accumulate since the first American heavy bomber missions over occupied Europe in the summer of 1942. He was not a combat pilot, and he was not a bombardier. He was a precision optics engineer who had been seconded to 8th Air Force Headquarters from a background in industrial metrology, the science of measurement. He had spent the pre-war years measuring things, building instruments to measure other instruments, and thinking about the gap between what a measuring device was designed to do and what it actually did under field conditions. What Tinkler saw in the bombing accuracy reports was a systematic, not a random, error. Random errors scatter around a true point in all directions. The inaccuracies he was cataloging showed a pattern, a consistent tendency for bombs to overshoot targets along the line of flight, particularly at high altitude and high indicated airspeed. To a metrologist, a systematic error means the instrument is not correctly calibrated for the conditions in which it is being used. The Norden was calibrated for one set of conditions and being operated in another. The specific problem Tinkler identified was subtle but consequential. The Norden's analog computer calculated bomb trajectory based on a set of physical assumptions about how a bomb behaved after it left the aircraft. One of those assumptions involved a relationship between indicated airspeed, the speed the aircraft's instruments reported, and true airspeed, the actual speed of the aircraft through the air. At low altitude, these two figures are close to identical. At high altitude, in thin air, they can differ by 30% or more. The bomb, once released, does not care about indicated airspeed. It cares about true airspeed, because that is the actual velocity it carries forward when it separates from the aircraft. If the bombardier fed indicated airspeed into the Norden's computer rather than true airspeed, which is what the training manuals instructed, because true airspeed required a separate calculation that added complexity and time to an already demanding procedure, the computer would underestimate the bomb's forward velocity and release it too late. The bomb would fly along, in the direction of flight. It would consistently overshoot. Tinkler wrote a technical memorandum in the autumn of 1942. He attached tables showing the magnitude of the error at various altitudes and speeds. He sent it up the chain of command. He received, in return, a reply from a staff officer at 8th Air Force Headquarters informing him that the Norden Mark 15 had been tested and validated by the Army Air Force's Material Command at Wright Field, Ohio, and that the accuracy figures from operational missions reflected crew training issues, not instrument error. He was advised to focus on his assigned duties. He wrote another memorandum in the spring of 1943. This one included data from post-strike photography that he had personally analyzed, showing a consistent overshoot pattern. He had tabulated results from 64 missions, and the pattern was unmistakable. He sent it not just up his own chain, but laterally to the bombardment group stationed around East Anglia. He received calls from 2 group bombardiers who told him they had noticed the same thing. He also received a visit from a colonel on the 8th Air Force staff who told him that distributing unauthorized technical assessments to line units was not appropriate, and that he should understand the effect such documents had on morale. Tinkler was not a man who gave speeches. People who worked with him later described him as quiet, meticulous, and somewhat humorless, a man who was more comfortable with a micrometer than with people. But he was also a man who had spent 20 years of his professional life in the discipline of measurement, and the core conviction of that discipline was simple. The number means what the number means. You do not change a number because it is inconvenient. You fix the instrument. He decided to fix the instrument. The Norden Mark 15 bomb sight was a controlled, classified piece of government equipment. It was maintained by specially trained armorers. It was not available to be borrowed, disassembled, or modified by a lieutenant colonel who was not part of the Army Air Force's material command. Tinkler found one anyway. A B-17 that had come back from a mission with heavy flak damage was declared a total write-off in January of 1943. The aircraft was to be stripped for salvageable parts before the airframe was scrapped. Tinkler arranged, through a friendship with a maintenance officer at Harwick, to take possession of the Norden unit before the scrapping crews arrived. The instrument was logged as damaged and non-reparable. Tinkler signed for it and carried it to a workbench in a corner of the station's instrument repair shop. He spent 3 weeks taking it apart. The Norden was not a simple device. It had been described by one of its early advocates as the most complex mass-produced mechanical instrument in history, and the description was not inaccurate. The main body of the sight contained a gyroscope assembly that weighed several pounds and spun at thousands of revolutions per minute. Around it were clutches, gears, and leveling mechanisms of extraordinary precision. The computer section contained a series of interconnected cams, shaped metal discs that translated rotational motion into mathematical functions, and mechanical integrator that accumulated the bombardier's tracking corrections and translated them into a release signal. The optical assembly sat on top of all of this, its telescope angled downward through a prism system. Every component was machined to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. Tinkler understood all of it. What he was looking for was a specific cam profile that governed the relationship between the airspeed input and the ballistic solution. He found it. A shaped brass disc about 3 inches in diameter, machined with a curved edge that represented a mathematical function relating airspeed to bomb trajectory. The curve had been designed for a specific range of altitudes and speeds. Beyond that range, the cams curve departed from the true mathematical relationship, not dramatically, a few percent, but at 23,000 feet and 230 indicated miles per hour, a few percent of a 5-mile horizontal distance was several hundred feet of error. He did not replace the cam. He could not manufacture a new one to the required precision in a workshop in Norfolk. What he did instead was design a correction mechanism, a small auxiliary input that could be set by the bombardier based on a pre-calculated table, adjusting the cam's output by the amount of the known error at a given altitude. It was, in principle, similar to correction cards that navigators use to account for known compass deviation errors, an acknowledgement that the instrument had a known and quantifiable bias that could be compensated for if you knew what you were doing. The physical modification was modest. A small additional dial on the operator's panel with a pointer and a scale, connected through a simple gear linkage to the existing mechanism. It added perhaps 1/4 pound to the instrument's weight. It required a bombardier to set one additional parameter before the bomb run, consulting a small printed table. It was not elegant. Tinkler knew that, but elegance was not the point. He tested the modified sight in the instrument shop using a mechanical test rig, a device that simulated the bomb run geometry and allowed him to measure the calculated release point for a given set of inputs. The unmodified sight, given the inputs typical of a high-altitude mission over Germany, 23,000 feet, 230 indicated miles per hour, 15,000-foot ceiling wind, produced a release point that would have put the bombs approximately 900 feet beyond the target. The modified sight, with the correction dial set appropriately, produce a release point within 150 feet. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. He wrote a new technical memorandum in June of 1943, this one with his test data attached. He sent it to 8th Air Force Headquarters, to the Material Command Liaison Office, and to the Inspector General. He also requested permission to conduct a live test, an actual bombing mission, using an aircraft equipped with his modified sight, so that the results could be validated against post-strike photography. The response from 8th Air Force Headquarters was swift and definitive. A brigadier general on the staff wrote back, informing Tinkler that the modification of classified government equipment without authorization from the Material Command was a violation of Army Air Forces regulations. The modified instrument was to be surrendered immediately. Tinkler was informed that further unauthorized modification activity would be referred for disciplinary action. He was reminded that the Norden bombsight program was one of the most sensitive technical programs in the United States military, and that any suggestion, however well-intentioned, that the instrument was inaccurate risked damaging crew confidence in a system that the entire strategic bombing campaign depended upon. The general did not engage with the data. He did not address the test results. He addressed the regulations. Tinkler surrendered the modified sight. He did not surrender the correction tables or the design drawings, which he kept in a locked case under his bunk. He also did not stop thinking. What he had built was a correction to a known error. The brass had told him the error did not officially exist. That was a position he could not accept, because his own instrument shop tests had demonstrated it with mechanical certainty. The question was not whether he was right. The question was how to prove it in a way that could not be dismissed. The answer came to him in the form of a bridge. In the late summer of 1943, the strategic situation in occupied France had produced a specific targeting problem that the precision bombing doctrine was supposed to be ideally suited for, but was, in practice, failing to solve. The railroad bridges over the Loire and Seine rivers were critical logistical choke points. German supply trains moving to the Atlantic coast and to the invasion beaches, though the invasion itself was still 8 months away, crossed these bridges. If the bridges could be destroyed, the German rail network in northern France would be significantly degraded. The problem was that bridges were precise targets. A bridge over a river might be 20 feet wide and 800 feet long. From 23,000 feet, hitting a 20-foot wide structure required bombing accuracy better than any the 8th Air Force had demonstrated in Europe. The post-strike photography from the few bridge attacks that had been attempted told a dispiriting story. Craters in the riverbed on both sides of the bridge, craters in the fields around the bridge, craters in the villages near the bridge, but the bridge itself standing largely intact, continuing to carry German freight trains toward the coast. Tinkler had followed these failures with the particular attention of a man who knows exactly why something is going wrong and has been told to stop saying so. He went back to his workbench. He could not legally modify another Norden, but the Norden was not the only precision optical instrument in the Army Air Force's inventory. And the problem he was trying to solve, how to deliver a bomb with greater precision from high altitude against a small, specific target, did not necessarily require modifying the standard production bomb sight. It might instead require building a different kind of instrument altogether. One designed from the beginning for the specific task of hitting small, precisely defined targets from very high altitude, incorporating the altitude and airspeed corrections that the Norden's cam mechanism could not fully accommodate, and adding a capability that the Norden entirely lacked. What Tinkler was working toward, though he would not have used the word at the time, was a bombing computer optimized for precision interdiction against point targets rather than for the area bombing of large industrial complexes. The distinction mattered more than the brass understood. The instrument Tinkler built over the following 6 weeks was not beautiful. It sat on his workbench in the instrument repair shop, and it looked, by most account of the men who saw it, like something assembled from the parts bin of a radio repair shop. There was no polished brass housing. There were no engraved scales. The body was machined from aluminum stock on the station's lathe by a sympathetic sergeant named Harold Briggs, who asked no questions and kept his mouth shut. The optical assembly was cannibalized from a damaged gun sight removed from a written-off P-47. The gyroscope was sourced from a surplus attitude indicator pulled from the same scrap pile that had given Tinkler his first Norden. What made it different from the standard sight was not its components. It was its philosophy. The Norden had been designed as a universal instrument, a single device that could be used by any bombardier against any target from any altitude within its operational envelope, with minimal pre-mission calculation. Its universality was its strength and its weakness. To be universal, it had to make assumptions. Those assumptions were encoded in the cam profiles, and those cam profiles represented the best average solution across a wide range of conditions rather than the optimal solution for any specific set of conditions. Tinkler's instrument was not universal. It was specialized. It was designed for one specific mission profile. High altitude, daylight precision attack against a target no wider than 30 feet, from altitudes between 20,000 and 25,000 feet, at indicated airspeeds between 200 and 250 miles per hour, within that specific envelope. He had optimized every parameter. The altitude airspeed correction that the Norden could only approximate was built directly into Tinkler's cam mechanism as a primary function, rather than an afterthought. He had also added something the Norden lacked entirely. The Norden computed a single release point, a specific moment at which to drop the bombs. It assumed the aircraft would fly a straight, steady course, and that all variables will remain constant during the bomb run. In practice, the aircraft drifted. The wind changed. The ground speed varied slightly as the aircraft flew through air of varying density. The Norden's computer accumulated these errors over the length of the bomb run, and by the time the release signal came, the small errors had compounded into large ones. Tinkler's instrument incorporated a continuous trail correction, a mechanism that recalculated the release point every few seconds based on updated tracking data, rather than integrating a single continuous solution. Each correction reset the accumulated error. The final release point was based on the most recent seconds of tracking rather than the entire bomb run. It was, in the language of later engineering, a closed-loop feedback system rather than an open-loop integration. The mathematics were not new. The application of them to a bomb release computer was. He completed the instrument in September of 1943 and tested it on his mechanical rig through October. The simulated accuracy figures were striking. A circular error probable of under 70 feet at 23,000 feet against a target whose ground speed he knew precisely. Against a bridge. Against a specific, narrow, fixed-point target. He needed to test it in the air. And he needed to do it without permission. The man Tinkler turned to was a B-17 pilot named Major Thomas Hughes, who commanded one of the lead crews at the 405th Bombardment Group at Hardwick. Led crews with most experienced and accurate bombardiers in the group, the men whose aim the entire formation would follow on a combat mission. Hughes had a reputation for operational innovation and a relaxed attitude toward paperwork. He had also lost friends on the Schweinfurt missions and was not inclined to defend the status quo on grounds of institutional loyalty. Tinkler showed Hughes the instrument and the test data. He explained the systematic error. He showed him the post-strike photography from the Lower Bridge attacks. Hughes looked at the photographs for a long time without speaking. Then he asked Tinkler how accurate he thought the instrument actually was. Tinkler told him the honest answer, that his bench test suggested a circular error probable of under 70 feet, but that a bench test was not the sky over France, and he would not know until he flew it. Hughes agreed to take the instrument on a training flight. They flew a practice bomb run over a target range in the east of England in November of 1943, dropping practice bombs from 22,000 feet. The range officers measured the impact points. The average miss distance was 63 feet. The standard Norden on the same mission, flown by the same crew against the same target, produced an average miss distance of 410 feet. Hughes looked at those numbers and told Tinkler they needed to take it to France. The opportunity came in February of 1944. The pre-invasion transportation plan, the systematic destruction of the French rail network to isolate the eventual landing beaches, was beginning to gather momentum at 8th Air Force headquarters. A series of bridge targets on the Seine had been assigned to the 405th. The primary target was a rail bridge at Vernon, a town on the Seine roughly 50 miles northwest of Paris, to which one of the main lines connecting Paris to the Normandy coast passed. The bridge was a standard double-track rail structure, approximately 18 feet wide at the deck. From 23,000 feet, it subtended an angle barely distinguishable from the surrounding river surface. Previous missions against similar bridges by other groups had produced post-strike photography showing the characteristic pattern: craters in the river, craters in the fields, the bridge intact. The targeting officers at 8th Air Force were beginning to develop a private conviction that rail bridges simply could not be destroyed by high-altitude bombing, a conviction they were reluctant to commit to paper because it implied that a central assumption of the entire strategic bombing doctrine was incorrect. Hughes submitted his mission plan showing Tinkler as the primary bombardier. The mission was approved without comment. There was nothing irregular in the paperwork. Tinkler's instrument was not mentioned in any official document. It was listed simply as the aircraft's bombing system. The Norden that was officially supposed to be installed in the aircraft was removed and placed in a storage lock of the night before the mission. The substitution was not logged. The morning of February 19th, 1944 was clear over eastern England and forecast to be clear over the Seine Valley. Tinkler arrived at the aircraft at 0400. He installed his instrument in the bombardier station, securing it to the standard mounting brackets with the same fittings that held the Norden. He spent 2 hours checking every component: gyroscope spin-up, optical alignment, cam calibration, trail correction mechanism. He set the altitude airspeed correction table for 23,000 feet and 220 indicated miles per hour, which was a planned cruise speed for formation on the bomb run. He had a card in his breast pocket with the correction values for every 1,000 feet of altitude between 18,000 and 26,000 feet, in case the formation flew higher or lower than planned. He had thought of everything he could think of. That was all he could do. The formation assembled over the English coast and headed southeast across the channel. Tinkler lay in the bombardier's position, his eye at the sight, watching the French coast slide beneath him. He was not thinking about the regulation he was violating. He was thinking about the bridge. He was thinking about the 18 feet of deck and the river on both sides and the way the wind correction would interact with the trail correction in the final seconds before release. He was running calculations in his head that he had run 100 times on his workbench. At 23,000 feet over the Seine Valley, the sky was clear and cold. The river below caught the February light and threw it back in a thin silver line. Tinkler found the bridge through the telescope, a thin dark stroke across the brightness of the water. From this altitude, it looked impossibly small. It looked like a crack in a mirror. He understood why bombardiers missed it. He began his tracking. The continuous trail correction mechanism was doing its work. He could feel in the smoothness of the tracking, the way the crosshairs held the target without the subtle drift and accumulation that characterized the Norden's behavior at the end of a long bomb run. The altitude airspeed correction was set. The gyroscope was steady. The formation was straight and level. What happened in the next 43 seconds was, by the account of Major Hughes watching from the cockpit, unremarkable to observe. There was no drama. The aircraft flew straight. Tinkler made small corrections. The release signal came. The bombs fell. Hughes did not know for certain what had happened until the strike photography was developed the following morning. The photographs showed the bridge at Vernon, or rather, they showed where the bridge at Vernon had been. 2 spans of the structure had been struck directly and collapsed into the river. The eastern approach had been hit by a 3rd bomb, destroying the abutment. The bridge was impassable. The rail line was severed. Of the 12 bombs dropped by Hughes's aircraft, 7 had struck within 50 feet of the center line of the bridge deck. 3 had struck the structure directly. The other aircraft in the formation, using standard Nordens, had produced a familiar pattern: craters in the river, craters in the fields. Hughes took the strike photography directly to the group commander, Colonel Arthur Marchetti. He also told Marchetti about Tinkler's instrument. He did not do this to expose Tinkler. He did it because the photographs made concealment pointless. The results were too dramatic to explain any other way, and Hughes had been in the Army long enough to know that dramatic, unexplained results attracted dangerous questions. Marchetti looked at the photographs for a long time. Then he looked at Hughes. Then he picked up the telephone. The call he made was not to the Inspector General. It was to the Deputy Commander of the 8th Air Force, Brigadier General Frederick Anderson. Marchetti was not a man given to institutional loyalty when it conflicted with operational results. He had lost too many crews over Germany to sentimentality about procedures. He told Anderson that he had strike photography he needed to see immediately. Anderson flew to Harwich that afternoon. He was shown the photographs. He was shown the results from the other aircraft. He was shown Tinkler's instrument, which Tinkler had by this point removed from the aircraft and placed back in its case. Half expecting to be arrested, Anderson picked up the instrument and turned it over in his hands. He asked Tinkler to explain it. Tinkler explained it. He spoke for 20 minutes. Anderson did not interrupt. When Tinkler finished, Anderson was quiet for a moment. He asked one question. He asked how long it would take to produce the instrument in sufficient quantities to equip every lead bombardier in the 8th Air Force. Tinkler told him he did not know because he had not thought about production. He had thought only about whether the instrument worked. Anderson told him he had 48 hours to find out. The answer, when Tinkler assembled it with the help of the station engineering officer and a telephone call to a precision instrument manufacturer in Birmingham, was 3 months for a production run of 50 units, provided the design was finalized and the required components could be sourced. Anderson authorized the production run the same day. He also, with a brevity that Tinkler found both impressive and slightly terrifying, told Tinkler that the matter of the unauthorized modification and the unlogged substitution of government equipment would not be pursued, provided Tinkler made himself available to the Material Command's engineering office to document everything he had done. Tinkler spent the next 3 weeks in a conference room at 8th Air Force headquarters explaining his instrument to engineers from Wright Field who had, 6 months earlier, told him that his first memorandum reflected a training problem rather than an instrument error. The meetings were professional and largely free of acknowledgement that anything had gone wrong before. The engineers asked precise questions, and Tinkler gave precise answers. The correction tables were validated against wind tunnel and ballistic data. The trail correction mechanism was tested on a Wright Field rig and found to perform within 5% of Tinkler's bench test results. The Wright Field report, completed in April of 1944, recommended adoption of what it called a high-precision point-target correction system based on the Tinkler modifications for use by lead crews in precision bridge and rail interdiction missions. It did not use Tinkler's name prominently. It referred to the design as emerging from field evaluation at the 405th Bombardment Group. Tinkler read the report in his workshop at Harwich and filed it without comment by June of 1944. The month the Allied armies landed on the beaches of Normandy, the modified instruments had been distributed to the lead bombardiers of 12 8th Air Force groups. The transportation plan against the French rail network was in full execution. Bridge after bridge on the Seine, and Loire was targeted. The results were not perfect, nothing in war ever is, but they were categorically different from what had come before. The Vernon Bridge strike was no longer an anomaly. It was becoming a template. The rail lines feeding the German positions in Normandy were being cut with a systematic efficiency that had not existed 6 months earlier. The German 7th Army, attempting to rush reinforcements to the beachhead in the days and weeks after the 6th of June, found bridges down, rail yards cratered, marshalling points destroyed. The movement that should have taken hours took days. The divisions that should have arrived at the front line intact arrived piecemeal, if they arrived at all. None of the generals who wrote their memoirs after the war gave Tinkler credit for this. The transportation plan was attributed to air commanders and their staff officers, to the foresight of the strategic planners, to the courage of the crews who flew the missions. These attributions were not inaccurate, but they were incomplete. The plan required not just a decision to strike the bridges, but the ability to actually hit them, and that ability had not existed in February of 1944, and did exist by June of 1944. And the difference between those two states was a quiet engineer in a workshop in Norfolk who had refused to accept that a systematic error was a training problem. Tinkler himself flew 4 more combat missions after Vernon, all of them as lead bombardier on bridge attacks. He was not a combat airman by training, and the missions aged him visibly. The flak over the Seine bridges was intense. The Germans understood as well as the Americans did how important the crossings were, and on one mission in May of 1944, the aircraft took hits that wounded 2 crew members and forced an emergency landing at a forward airfield in southern England. Tinkler walked away from that landing and spent the following hours sitting on a fuel drum beside the runway, staring at nothing, before he stood up and helped the ground crew inspect the aircraft for structural damage. He was awarded the Legion of Merit in August of 1944. The citation described his contribution to bombing accuracy in general terms. It did not mention the Vernon Bridge. It did not mention the memoranda that had been returned to him, or the modified site that had been confiscated, or the brigadier general who had told him that further unauthorized modification activity would result in disciplinary action. Award citations are not confessional documents. What the citation also did not mention, because it could not, because the full scope of the contribution was still unfolding, was what Tinkler's instrument represented beyond its immediate operational utility. The systematic error he had identified and corrected was not peculiar to the Norden Mark 15. It was inherent to any bombing computer that encoded physical assumptions in fixed mechanical cam profiles and operated outside the altitude and speed envelope those profiles had been designed for. The correction Tinkler had applied, the continuous trail correction, the altitude airspeed compensation, the closed-loop feedback architecture, were solutions to general problems that any future high-altitude precision bombing system would face. The engineers at the Material Command who had sat with Tinkler in that conference room at 8th Air Force Headquarters had understood this, even if they did not say so openly. The documentation they produced did not simply describe how to replicate Tinkler's instrument. It described, in the careful language of technical specification, the principles that made it work. Those principles found their way into the development programs for post-war precision bombing systems. The feedback loop that Tinkler had built by hand from salvage parts appeared, refined and miniaturized, in the bombing computers of the next generation of aircraft. The philosophy that an instrument should correct for known errors rather than assume they do not exist became embedded in the design methodology of American precision weapons development in the decades that followed. The bridge at Vernon was rebuilt by the Germans within 6 weeks of its destruction and destroyed again by Allied aircraft 3 weeks after that. The cycle of destruction and repair continued until the German withdrawal from France in the summer of 1944 rendered the question of who controlled the Seine crossings irrelevant. After the war, the bridge was rebuilt again, and it stands today, carrying rail traffic across the river at the same point it crossed in 1944. There is no marker on it. There is nothing to indicate that it was once the site of a proof of concept for an unauthorized instrument built in a workshop by a man who had been told to stop asking questions. Kenneth Tinkler returned to the United States in the autumn of 1944. He was reassigned to Material Command at Wright Field, where he spent the final year of the war working on the next generation of precision bombing systems. He left the Army Air Forces in 1946 as a lieutenant colonel and returned to industrial metrology, the work of measuring things precisely, of cataloging the gap between what instruments were supposed to do and what they actually did. He lived quietly in Dayton, Ohio, for the rest of his life. He gave one interview to a historian at the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1971, a transcript of which exists in the archives at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. In that interview, he was asked whether he felt vindicated by the adoption of his principles in post-war weapons development. He thought about the question for a while before answering. He said that vindication was not quite the right word. He said that what he had done was simply measure something accurately and report the measurement. The measurement was correct when he reported it, and it was still correct when the institution decided to accept it. The measurement had not changed. Only the willingness to look at it had changed. He was asked whether he felt angry about the months of resistance, the confiscated instrument, the threat of court-martial. He said he did not think anger was a useful engineering tool. He said that the institution had behaved as institutions behave, carefully, conservatively, with a preference for protecting established systems over investigating reported flaws. He understood the logic of it, even when he was on the receiving end of it. A strategic bombing campaign was not the time or place to publicly acknowledge that the precision instrument the entire campaign rested upon had a correctable systematic error. The stakes of that acknowledgement, in crew confidence, in political credibility, in the morale of men who were dying to deliver bombs they believed were landing precisely, were genuinely high. The staff officers who returned his memoranda were not fools, and they were not cowards. They were making a calculation about what they could afford to examine at that particular moment in the war. He said he understood that. He still believed he was right to keep pushing. He was then asked about the Vernon Bridge, specifically about the moment when the photographs came back and showed the collapsed spans. He was quiet for a while. Then he said something that the historian noted verbatim in the transcript. He said that he did not feel triumph when he saw the photographs. He felt the particular relief of a man who has been arguing that a measuring instrument has a known error and is finally given access to a measurement that settles the question. The argument was over. He could go back to work. Kenneth Tinkler died in 1983. He is buried in Dayton. His obituary in a local paper described him as a retired military officer and precision instrument engineer. It did not mention the Vernon Bridge. It did not mention the modified bomb site. It did not mention the memoranda or the threatened court-martial or the conference room at Hardwick where he spent 3 weeks explaining the physics of bomb trajectory to engineers who had told him, 18 months earlier, that his concerns reflected a training problem. The B-17 in which he flew the Vernon mission was shot down over Germany in March of 1944, 6 weeks after the bridge attack, with a different crew. Major Hughes completed his tour and rotated home to California in May of 1944. Sergeant Harold Briggs, who had machined the aluminum housing for Tinkler's instrument without asking questions, was killed by a V-1 flying bomb that struck the Hardwick station in the summer of 1944. The instrument itself, the original hand-built prototype, was placed in storage at Wright Field after the war along with thousands of other items from the development programs of the early 1940s. At some point in the 1950s, the storage facility was reorganized and the instrument was logged as miscellaneous surplus optical equipment and scrapped. The correction tables that Tinkler had carried in his breast pocket over France survived because he had kept a copy in his personal papers. Those papers are now in the possession of his daughter in Cincinnati. What Tinkler had understood in the end was something that the Army Air Forces learned slowly and at considerable cost in the skies over Europe, that a doctrine built on an instrument's theoretical capability was only as sound as the honest accounting of the gap between theory and practice. The Norden bomb sight was a genuine technological achievement. It could do what its advocates claimed within the conditions for which it had been designed. The error lay not in the instrument, but in the assumption that the instrument's design conditions and its operational conditions were the same thing. That assumption was made not out of ignorance, but out of necessity, out of the institutional requirement to have confidence in the precision bombing doctrine, because without that confidence the doctrine collapsed, and with it the entire rationale for the American strategic bombing campaign. Tinkler had not tried to destroy that confidence. He had tried to correct a measurement. The distinction was one that the institution could not easily see from the inside, because inside the institution, the measurement and the confidence had become entangled. The precision of a Norden was not just a technical specification. It was a moral and strategic proposition. To question the precision was to question the proposition, and to question the proposition was to question the men who had built the doctrine and the men who were dying to execute it. He had questioned it anyway, quietly, methodically, with tables and correction factors, and a prototype built from salvage parts. He had not needed to make a speech. He had needed to hit a bridge. The bridge made the argument that the memoranda could not. The photograph said what the data had always said, in a language that the institution was finally able to hear. And in the weeks and months that followed, as the lead bombardiers of the 8th Air Force flew their modified instruments over the bridges of the Seine and the Loire, the argument that Tinkler had been making since the autumn of 1942, the argument that had been returned to him, dismissed, and filed away, settled quietly and permanently into the bones of American precision bombing doctrine, not because a general had listened, not because an institution had changed its mind, but because a bridge had fallen into a river on a clear February morning, and the photographs were unambiguous, and the gap between what the instrument was supposed to do and what it actually did had been closed, at last, by a man with correction table and a welded aluminum housing, and the particular stubbornness of someone who has spent a career measuring things and knows, with professional certainty, what it means when the numbers do not add up. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.